Here are the 50 most commonly asked interview questions and answers in Senior and Staff Salesforce LWC Developer interviews.
The Senior LWC interview reality.
Imagine walking into a Senior or Staff Salesforce LWC interview, and the interviewer fires questions that 95% of candidates have never even thought about. But here is the secret. These are not rare edge cases. These are the most commonly asked questions at the enterprise level,
where most candidates freeze.
They are going to ask you about concurrency, optimistic locking, large-scale architecture, real-time platform events, and production-grade performance for 50,000-plus records. Most people freeze because they only know textbook definitions. But after watching this video, you will not.
The 50 most frequently asked questions.
In the next 90 minutes, I am giving you the exact 50 most frequently asked Senior LWC interview questions that top companies are actually asking in 2026-plus interviews. And more importantly, I am giving you the precise, battle-tested answers that prove you operate at the staff architect level.
No theory, no beginner stuff.
You will get only real staff engineer-level explanations, trade-offs, and patterns I have used in production. If you are targeting Senior LWC roles or above, stay until the end. Because by the time this video finishes, you will have the exact answers that separate the hired from the rejected. Let's dive in.
1. Can we call the enabled function in the Apex class using wire?
Answer: yes, but only when the method is explicitly annotated with cacheable equals true. At the staff level, I treat this as a deliberate architectural guardrail. The wire service is intentionally restricted to read-only operations so that Salesforce can safely serve data from the client-side cache without hitting the database on every render. Attempting to wire a non-cacheable method fails silently at runtime, which is exactly why I enforce a strict separation. Wire for all read paths, an imperative Apex exclusively for DML or time-sensitive operations.
2. What do you mean by cacheable equals true annotations?
Answer: cacheable equals true is not just a performance flag. It is a strict contract with the Salesforce platform that this method will never perform DML, callouts, or non-idempotent operations. When enabled, the wire service aggressively caches the result at both the browser and platform levels, enabling sub-100 milliseconds response times under heavy load. In design reviews, I always push back on developers who overuse imperative calls for read operations, because every non-cacheable call bypasses this caching layer, increases governor usage, and creates unnecessary network round trips.
3. Why do we use the dollar symbol when passing a property in a wire function?
Answer: the dollar prefix is the reactivity contract in LWC. It tells the wire adapter that the parameter is dynamic and must re-execute the entire wire service whenever that source property changes. Without it, the adapter treats the value as static and never refires, a mistake I still see in codebases that silently show stale data. I treat every wired parameter with a dollar as a potential performance hotspot, always evaluating whether automatic reactivity is required, or if a controlled imperative refresh would be more efficient.
4. When is the wire method or property called in the life cycle of a component?
Answer: the wire service executes in two distinct phases. It fires once immediately after the constructor, often with undefined values, and then fires again after connected callback once all reactive parameters are resolved. This double invocation is intentional but easy to overlook, leading to duplicate Apex calls or null pointer race conditions. In enterprise applications, I always wrap wire logic with defensive guard clauses to prevent the first empty call from doing unnecessary work.
5. What are lifecycle hooks in LWC, and how do they execute in parent-child components?
Answer: the LWC lifecycle follows a strict top-down initialization and bottom-up rendering contract. The execution order is parent constructor to parent connected callback to child constructor to child connected callback to child rendered callback to parent rendered callback. Any deviation or misuse, especially mutating state inside rendered callback, creates infinite render loops that only surface under production load. Staff-level engineers treat this execution order as a design surface, using it to coordinate data fetching and third-party library mounting with surgical precision.
The universal interview tip. Whenever you ask a tech VP or an industry mentor how to crack a tough interview, they all give you the exact same tip. Get familiar with the most commonly asked interview questions. It sounds simple, right? But here is the problem. The search nightmare. Finding the actual most commonly asked questions for senior roles is a nightmare. Generic Google searches only give you basic textbook definitions, and those will not help you clear a lead architect or senior engineer round where production reality matters. Imagine a master vault. Now, imagine a vault where the absolute most commonly asked interview questions for your specific role are already collected for you, perfectly organized by interview rounds like 1. Most commonly asked technical-based question and answers. 2. Most commonly asked scenario-based question and answers. 3. Most commonly asked real-world problem-solving question and answers. 4. Most commonly asked system design question and answers. 5. Most commonly asked behavioral-based question and answers. Cross-domain mastery. I built the ACE Interviews Master Vault for the modern architect. We did not just do this for one role. We covered everything: SAP, cybersecurity, DevOps, software testing, data engineering, Java, and Python. The ultimate all-access deal. Instead of paying for individual PDFs, you can now unlock our entire database. Get over 1,000 plus PDFs containing 50,000 plus of the most asked question and answers for a mere 1,499 rupees a month. The elite transformation. Stop studying just to pass. Equip yourself with the cross-domain confidence of a true architect and walk out of your next interview choosing between 2 or 3 elite job offers. Unlock the vault now. The era of buying individual guides is over. Click the link in the video description below right now to unlock the Master Vault. Now, let's get back to the masterclass.
6. What is the difference between connected callback and rendered callback in LWC?
Answer: connected callback is the only safe hook for one-time initialization, setting up listeners, or kicking off data fetches because the component is in the DOM but has not yet rendered. Rendered callback fires after every single render and is reserved exclusively for DOM measurements or third-party library interactions. The cardinal rule at the staff level is never mutate reactive properties inside rendered callback, as it guarantees an infinite loop. Most candidates lose points here because they treat both hooks as interchangeable.
7. What are decorators in LWC and their purposes? At API, at track, at wire.
Answer: at API defines the public contract. Anything decorated with it becomes part of the component's external API and must be treated with strict backward compatibility. At track creates deep reactive state. Since spring 2020, all primitives are reactive by default, so a senior engineer only uses at track to observe mutations inside complex objects or arrays. At wire is the declarative data fetching layer that automatically manages caching, loading states, and error states. Misusing any of these, like exposing internal state via at API, is the fastest way to create tightly coupled, unmaintainable component graphs.
8. How do you call Apex methods from LWC using at wire versus imperative calls?
Answer: I use at wire for every read-only operation that benefits from automatic caching, reactivity, and zero boilerplate. I switch to imperative calls the moment I need DML, custom error handling, precise timing like button clicks, or when I must bypass the cache for absolute data freshness. In large applications, I also use imperative calls when I need to orchestrate multiple sequential operations with proper transaction boundaries. Never use wire for anything that mutates data. That single decision impacts performance and debuggability more than most developers realize.
9. What is the shadow DOM in LWC, and how does it affect styling and encapsulation?
Answer: Shadow DOM provides true style and DOM encapsulation. No external CSS can leak in, and no internal selectors can leak out. This prevents the classic CSS wars we saw in Aura, but it forces us to be intentional about style exposure. At the staff level, I design components using CSS custom properties and host selectors so consumers can theme them without breaking encapsulation. Anyone who resorts to global styles or important flags is immediately flagged as lacking enterprise UI architecture experience.
10. How do you communicate between unrelated LWC components?
Answer: for any components that do not share a direct parent-child relationship, I exclusively use Lightning Message Service, LMS. It is the only officially supported, secure, and governor-friendly pub-sub mechanism. I never allow global variables, window objects, or static Apex classes to be used for communication. Those patterns collapse under load and create impossible to debug race conditions. In enterprise applications, LMS channels become part of the overall architecture contract and are documented exactly like API endpoints.
The universal interview tip. Whenever you ask a tech VP or an industry mentor how to crack a tough interview, they all give you the exact same tip. Get familiar with the most commonly asked interview questions. It sounds simple, right? But here is the problem. The search nightmare. Finding the actual most commonly asked questions for senior roles is a nightmare. Generic Google searches only give you basic textbook definitions, and those will not help you clear a lead architect or senior engineer round where production reality matters. Imagine a master vault. Now, imagine a vault where the absolute most commonly asked interview questions for your specific role are already collected for you, perfectly organized by interview rounds like 1. Most commonly asked technical-based question and answers. 2. Most commonly asked scenario-based question and answers. 3. Most commonly asked real-world problem-solving question and answers. 4. Most commonly asked system design question and answers. 5. Most commonly asked behavioral-based question and answers. Cross-domain mastery. I built the ACE Interviews Master Vault for the modern architect. We did not just do this for one role. We covered everything: SAP, cybersecurity, DevOps, software testing, data engineering, Java, and Python. The ultimate all-access deal. Instead of paying for individual PDFs, you can now unlock our entire database. Get over 1,000 plus PDFs containing 50,000 plus of the most asked question and answers for a mere 1,499 rupees a month. The elite transformation. Stop studying just to pass. Equip yourself with the cross-domain confidence of a true architect and walk out of your next interview choosing between 2 or 3 elite job offers. Unlock the vault now. The era of buying individual guides is over. Click the link in the video description below right now to unlock the Master Vault. Now, let's get back to the masterclass.
11. How do you pass data from parent to child and child to parent in LWC?
Answer: parent-to-child communication uses that API decorator on a public property or method, which is simple, reactive, and declarative. Child-to-parent communication always uses a custom event with a well-defined detail payload. I never use public methods for upward communication because it creates tight coupling. In staff-level reviews, I emphasize that every event name must follow a strict naming convention. The payload must be typed, and we avoid event bubbling, unless absolutely necessary to keep the component tree loosely coupled.
12. What is Lightning Message Service, LMS, and when do you use it?
Answer: Lightning Message Service is the official, secure pub-sub channel for LWC. I use it exclusively in these staff-level scenarios, when components have no direct parent-child relationship, for example, different tabs, distinct page sections, or dynamically loaded components. When multiple unrelated components must react to the exact same business event in real time. When I need to broadcast state changes across the entire application without creating tight architectural coupling. I never use global variables, static Apex classes, or window objects. Those patterns collapse at scale. Every LMS channel is treated as an architectural contract and documented exactly like an API.
13. What is Lightning Data Service, LDS, and when would you prefer it over Apex calls?
Answer: Lightning Data Service is the platform's declarative CRUD layer that automatically handles field-level security, FLS, sharing rules, caching, and record notifications. I prefer LDS over Apex when the operation is a simple record create, read, update, or delete, and I want the platform to manage caching and UI refreshes for free. I switch to Apex the moment I need complex SOQL, custom transaction logic, data aggregation, or when I must guarantee a strict, single transaction boundary. In staff-level architecture, choosing between LDS and Apex is a deliberate performance and maintainability decision, not just a default habit.
14. How do you optimize performance in large LWC applications, displaying 50,000 plus records?
Answer: for 50K plus records, I never load everything at once. The staff-level strategy relies on virtual scrolling or infinite loading on the UI side, combined with server-side pagination using offset and limit. I make imperative apex calls only when the user scrolls or explicitly filters the data. Furthermore, I enforce debouncing on all search inputs, memoization of computed properties, lazy loading of non-critical components, and strict monitoring of the JavaScript bundle size via the Salesforce CLI. The goal is sub-2-second perceived performance even at enterprise scale. Anything less is unacceptable.
15. How would you implement inline editing in an LWC data table with bulk save via Apex?
Answer: at senior level, interviewers expect you to handle optimistic UI, draft values, error handling, partial failures, and rollback logic, not just a basic editable table. I start by using the Lightning Data Table component with the editable and draft values attributes bound to a track property. The data is fetched using @wire from an Apex method that returns the records, with key field equals ID for proper tracking. In the JavaScript, I listen to the onSave event, extract the draft values from event.detail, and pass them to a separate @Aura-enabled Apex method for bulk update. After the Apex call succeeds, I clear the draft values, show a success toast, and call refresh Apex on the wired result to get fresh data from the server. If the save fails, I intentionally do not clear the draft values so the user can correct the errors inline, and I show an error toast. I also handle the onCancel event to reset everything cleanly. This pattern ensures a smooth, production-ready experience with proper state management, server synchronization, and user feedback. In real projects, I extend it further with for update locking for concurrency, optimistic UI, showing a loading spinner during save, and server-side validation before any DML. This is exactly what separates mid-level from senior implementations.
16. How do you track modified rows and handle rollback on partial failures in LWC?
Answer: I track modified rows using the draft values array itself, while maintaining a separate original snapshot and a track property for rollback purposes. On a partial failure, I keep draft values intact so the user sees exactly which rows failed. I surface per row error messages using the data table's built-in error attribute for precise user feedback. I roll back only the failed records on the client side and allow the user to correct and retry. At the staff level, I also implement optimistic UI, immediate visual updates, paired with a true server rollback strategy using Apex save points when the business process requires strict all-or-nothing transaction behavior.
The universal interview tip. Whenever you ask a tech VP or an industry mentor how to crack a tough interview, they all give you the exact same tip. Get familiar with the most commonly asked interview questions. It sounds simple, right? But here is the problem. The search nightmare. Finding the actual most commonly asked questions for senior roles is a nightmare. Generic Google searches only give you basic textbook definitions, and those will not help you clear a lead architect or senior engineer round where production reality matters. Imagine a master vault. Now, imagine a vault where the absolute most commonly asked interview questions for your specific role are already collected for you, perfectly organized by interview rounds like 1. Most commonly asked technical-based question and answers. 2. Most commonly asked scenario-based question and answers. 3. Most commonly asked real-world problem-solving question and answers. 4. Most commonly asked system design question and answers. 5. Most commonly asked behavioral-based question and answers. Cross-domain mastery. I built the ACE Interviews Master Vault for the modern architect. We did not just do this for one role. We covered everything: SAP, cybersecurity, DevOps, software testing, data engineering, Java, and Python. The ultimate all-access deal. Instead of paying for individual PDFs, you can now unlock our entire database. Get over 1,000 plus PDFs containing 50,000 plus of the most asked question and answers for a mere 1,499 rupees a month. The elite transformation. Stop studying just to pass. Equip yourself with the cross-domain confidence of a true architect and walk out of your next interview choosing between 2 or 3 elite job offers. Unlock the vault now. The era of buying individual guides is over. Click the link in the video description below right now to unlock the Master Vault. Now, let's get back to the masterclass.
17. How would you implement deep linking and navigation using navigation mixin in LWC?
Answer: I always use navigation mixin to generate proper framework-compliant Salesforce URLs for records, list views, custom pages, or external links. At the staff level, I wrap this mixin inside a reusable utility service component. This ensures that every navigation event across the org is consistent, trackable, and functions correctly whether the user is in Lightning Experience, a console app, digital experiences, communities, or the Salesforce mobile app. I also strictly manage the state parameter to pass context, ensuring deep links remain fully functional even if a user bookmarks and hard refreshes the page.
18. How do you implement client-side and server-side sorting in Lightning Data Table?
Answer: I use client-side sorting in JavaScript for small result sets, typically under 2,000 rows, because it is instantaneous and avoids unnecessary server round trips. For anything larger, I immediately switch to server-side sorting. I capture the onsort event, extract the sorted by and sort direction values, and pass them to an imperative Apex call that dynamically appends an order by clause to the SOQL query. I then update the data and refresh the table. The decision boundary between client and server sorting is always dictated by data volume and is explicitly documented as part of the component's performance contract.
19. How would you prevent one user from overriding another user's changes in LWC?
Answer: I prevent data overrides by combining client-side optimistic locking with server-side record locking. On initial load, I capture the system mod stamp or a custom version control field. Before dispatching any update, I check this version. If it has changed in the database, I intercept the save, display a record was modified by another user warning, and force a data refresh so they can review the latest state. This UI pattern, backed by Apex for update row locking during the final transaction, eliminates the classic last one wins concurrency problem that mid-level teams usually ignore.
20. How do you implement virtual scrolling or lazy loading for large lists in LWC?
Answer: I implement true virtual scrolling using the Lightning Data Table's load more event combined with strictly controlled server-side pagination. I maintain offset and limit variables in the JavaScript state, and fetch the next page of records only when the user scrolls near the bottom threshold. I then append the new results to the existing array without refetching previous pages. For extremely large datasets or complex DOM structures, I also add a manual load more button as a fallback for mobile users or slower networks. This keeps DOM node count and memory usage low, ensuring response times remain under 500 milliseconds even with 100K plus records.
The universal interview tip. Whenever you ask a tech VP or an industry mentor how to crack a tough interview, they all give you the exact same tip. Get familiar with the most commonly asked interview questions. It sounds simple, right? But here is the problem. The search nightmare. Finding the actual most commonly asked questions for senior roles is a nightmare. Generic Google searches only give you basic textbook definitions, and those will not help you clear a lead architect or senior engineer round where production reality matters. Imagine a master vault. Now, imagine a vault where the absolute most commonly asked interview questions for your specific role are already collected for you, perfectly organized by interview rounds like 1. Most commonly asked technical-based question and answers. 2. Most commonly asked scenario-based question and answers. 3. Most commonly asked real-world problem-solving question and answers. 4. Most commonly asked system design question and answers. 5. Most commonly asked behavioral-based question and answers. Cross-domain mastery. I built the ACE Interviews Master Vault for the modern architect. We did not just do this for one role. We covered everything: SAP, cybersecurity, DevOps, software testing, data engineering, Java, and Python. The ultimate all-access deal. Instead of paying for individual PDFs, you can now unlock our entire database. Get over 1,000 plus PDFs containing 50,000 plus of the most asked question and answers for a mere 1,499 rupees a month. The elite transformation. Stop studying just to pass. Equip yourself with the cross-domain confidence of a true architect and walk out of your next interview choosing between 2 or 3 elite job offers. Unlock the vault now. The era of buying individual guides is over. Click the link in the video description below right now to unlock the Master Vault. Now, let's get back to the masterclass.
21. How do you dynamically fetch and handle dependent picklist values in LWC?
Answer: I use the get picklist values by record type wire adapter from the UI object info API module to handle dynamic dependent picklists without writing Apex. I first fetch the controlling field values. Then, on the change event of the controlling field, I immediately utilize the API again, passing the new controlling value to resolve the valid dependent options. At the staff level, I also cache the entire picklist dependency map in memory once it is loaded, ensuring that subsequent user selections are instantaneous and that I never make duplicate wire calls to the platform.
22. How would you implement real-time updates in LWC using platform events?
Answer: I subscribe to platform events using the Lightning/EMP API module during the connected callback hook, and I ensure I explicitly unsubscribe in the disconnected callback to prevent memory leaks. Upon receiving a message payload, I either refresh the entire wired result or surgically update only the affected record in the local JavaScript array to prevent full DOM re-renders. For high-frequency event streams, I implement debouncing and batching logic in the callback so the UI thread does not freeze. This is the gold standard pattern for any real-time dashboard or collaborative feature in enterprise LWC applications.
23. How do you handle record locking and stale data in multi-user LWC scenarios?
Answer: I treat record locking and stale data as a non-negotiable concurrency problem in any multi-user LWC application. The pattern I enforce is capture the system mod stamp or a custom version field on initial load. Then on every save I pass that version back to Apex where I perform a version check before any DML. If the version has changed, I reject the update, force a full refresh, and show a clear record modified by another user. Please review and retry message. This, combined with Apex for update locking where business rules demand it, completely eliminates the last one wins nightmare that mid-level teams usually ignore until production incidents hit.
24. How do you approach architecting a large-scale Salesforce LWC application?
Answer: for a large-scale LWC application, hundreds of components, thousands of users, I follow a structured production-first architecture approach. 1. Domain-driven component design. I break the app into self-contained domains, for example, reporting, admin, instead of building one giant component. 2. Composition over inheritance. I design small, single responsibility components and compose them using slots and public APIs to keep the tree maintainable. 3. Centralized state management. I use a combination of LDS, LMS, and custom pub substores. I never scatter state across multiple components. 4. Performance-first mindset. I enforce pagination and virtual scrolling everywhere, utilize memoization, and strictly monitor bundle size via the Salesforce CLI. 5. Security and governance. All data access goes through Apex with proper FLS and CRUD checks, utilizing LWS-compliant patterns and proper error boundaries. 6. Testing and CI/CD. I mandate 90% plus Jest coverage and utilize Salesforce DX with automated deployment pipelines for every release. 7. Scalability planning. I design for future growth, including multi-org support, offline capability, and easy migration to newer Salesforce features. This approach ensures the application remains fast and maintainable even when the team grows or requirements explode.
25. How do you ensure LWC components are performant and efficient?
Answer: performance is a first-class design concern, not an afterthought. I enforce virtual scrolling for any list over 2,000 rows, aggressive debouncing on all search and filter inputs, memoization of expensive computed properties, lazy loading of non-critical components, and strict bundle size monitoring via the Salesforce CLI. I also limit at wire usage to only truly reactive data and replace the rest with controlled imperative calls. In staff-level reviews, I always ask, what is the perceived load time under worst-case data volume? Because anything above 2 seconds is unacceptable in enterprise applications.
The universal interview tip. Whenever you ask a tech VP or an industry mentor how to crack a tough interview, they all give you the exact same tip. Get familiar with the most commonly asked interview questions. It sounds simple, right? But here is the problem. The search nightmare. Finding the actual most commonly asked questions for senior roles is a nightmare. Generic Google searches only give you basic textbook definitions, and those will not help you clear a lead architect or senior engineer round where production reality matters. Imagine a master vault. Now, imagine a vault where the absolute most commonly asked interview questions for your specific role are already collected for you, perfectly organized by interview rounds like 1. Most commonly asked technical-based question and answers. 2. Most commonly asked scenario-based question and answers. 3. Most commonly asked real-world problem-solving question and answers. 4. Most commonly asked system design question and answers. 5. Most commonly asked behavioral-based question and answers. Cross-domain mastery. I built the ACE Interviews Master Vault for the modern architect. We did not just do this for one role. We covered everything: SAP, cybersecurity, DevOps, software testing, data engineering, Java, and Python. The ultimate all-access deal. Instead of paying for individual PDFs, you can now unlock our entire database. Get over 1,000 plus PDFs containing 50,000 plus of the most asked question and answers for a mere 1,499 rupees a month. The elite transformation. Stop studying just to pass. Equip yourself with the cross-domain confidence of a true architect and walk out of your next interview choosing between 2 or 3 elite job offers. Unlock the vault now. The era of buying individual guides is over. Click the link in the video description below right now to unlock the Master Vault. Now, let's get back to the masterclass.
26. What is your strategy for handling complex state management in LWC?
Answer: for complex state, I follow a layered strategy. Lightning Data Service for simple CRUD, Lightning Message Service for cross-domain events, and a lightweight custom store like a PubSub or Redux pattern, only when LDS cannot meet the requirements. I never scatter state across multiple components. At the staff level, the store is always centralized, observable, and comes with clear rules for mutations, debugging hooks, and performance guards so that even with dozens of components listening, the application never suffers from unnecessary re-renders.
27. How do you integrate LWC components with external systems and APIs?
Answer: I route every external integration through named credentials and Apex proxy methods so that authentication, IP restrictions, and security are handled entirely server-side. On the LWC side, I use imperative calls with proper timeout and retry logic, never exposing API keys or tokens client-side. In staff-level architecture, I also build reusable integration services with circuit breaker patterns and comprehensive logging so that when an external system goes down, the LWC application degrades gracefully instead of breaking completely.
28. How do you ensure accessibility standards in LWC applications?
Answer: accessibility is baked into the component library from day one. I enforce area labels, role attributes, keyboard navigation, focus management, and proper semantic HTML on every custom component. I run automated AX audits in the CI pipeline and manual screen reader testing before every major release. At the staff level, I treat WCA G2.1 AIA compliance as a strict non-functional requirement, not a nice-to-have, because enterprise applications are used by people with diverse abilities and Salesforce itself expects strict compliance.
29. How do you handle error handling, logging, and security concerns in LWC?
Answer: I implement a centralized error boundary pattern using try or catch around all async operations, consistent toast notifications with user-friendly messages, and server-side logging via platform events or custom objects for every critical failure. Security is enforced at the apex layer with explicit FLS and CRUD checks, never trusting client-side logic. In staff-level code, I also ensure no sensitive data ever leaks into client-side variables or the browser console, and I treat every error as an opportunity to capture context that helps us debug proactively in production.
30. How do you optimize LWC components for mobile devices?
Answer: mobile optimization starts with responsive design using SLDS breakpoints and Lightning layout components that adapt automatically. I enforce touch-friendly targets, reduced visual clutter on small screens, lazy loading of heavy components, and minimal use of hover states. I also test every feature in the Salesforce mobile app and use the mobile simulator aggressively. At the staff level, I treat mobile performance as equal to desktop. If it feels slow or clunky on a phone, it fails the architecture review.
The universal interview tip. Whenever you ask a tech VP or an industry mentor how to crack a tough interview, they all give you the exact same tip. Get familiar with the most commonly asked interview questions. It sounds simple, right? But here is the problem. The search nightmare. Finding the actual most commonly asked questions for senior roles is a nightmare. Generic Google searches only give you basic textbook definitions, and those will not help you clear a lead architect or senior engineer round where production reality matters. Imagine a master vault. Now, imagine a vault where the absolute most commonly asked interview questions for your specific role are already collected for you, perfectly organized by interview rounds like 1. Most commonly asked technical-based question and answers. 2. Most commonly asked scenario-based question and answers. 3. Most commonly asked real-world problem-solving question and answers. 4. Most commonly asked system design question and answers. 5. Most commonly asked behavioral-based question and answers. Cross-domain mastery. I built the ACE Interviews Master Vault for the modern architect. We did not just do this for one role. We covered everything: SAP, cybersecurity, DevOps, software testing, data engineering, Java, and Python. The ultimate all-access deal. Instead of paying for individual PDFs, you can now unlock our entire database. Get over 1,000 plus PDFs containing 50,000 plus of the most asked question and answers for a mere 1,499 rupees a month. The elite transformation. Stop studying just to pass. Equip yourself with the cross-domain confidence of a true architect and walk out of your next interview choosing between 2 or 3 elite job offers. Unlock the vault now. The era of buying individual guides is over. Click the link in the video description below right now to unlock the Master Vault. Now, let's get back to the masterclass.
31. What is your experience with unit testing LWC components using Jest?
Answer: I maintain 90% plus Jest coverage on all LWC components in every production project. My testing strategy includes mocking all at wire adapters and Apex calls so tests run instantly and deterministically without server dependency. Testing every public at API property, every custom event payload, and every possible error execution path, using snapshot testing for the rendered markup and the user event library for simulating clicks and input changes. Running tests in the CI pipeline on every pull request with strict pass or fail quality gates. This level of testing is what gives enterprise teams the confidence to deploy weekly without breaking existing functionality.
32. How do you manage localization and internationalization in LWC?
Answer: I rely on Salesforce's built-in translation workbench and custom labels for all static text, combined with the standard Intel API for dynamic formatting of dates, currencies, and numbers. Every string that could be user-facing goes into custom labels so translators can work without ever touching the codebase. At the staff level, I also ensure right-to-left support is tested early in the design phase, and that number and currency formatting strictly respects the user's locale settings instead of assuming US English defaults.
33. How do you use custom events for component communication in LWC?
Answer: custom events are my default upward communication mechanism. I enforce the following rules strictly. 1. Event names are always kebab case and descriptive, such as save record or record changed. 2. The detail payload is a clean, versioned object containing only the specific data the parent actually needs to react. 3. I never bubble events unless the component is a true transparent wrapper. 4. Every event must have a corresponding handler in the parent component that is thoroughly unit tested. This pattern keeps components loosely coupled even when the application grows to hundreds of distinct components.
34. How do you refresh wired data or cache after imperative Apex calls?
Answer: refreshing wired data after an imperative call is a classic source of stale UI bugs, so I treat it as a deliberate architectural step. The staff-level pattern I always follow is 1. After a successful imperative call, immediately invoke refresh Apex on the stored wired result reference. 2. For UI record API or LDS data, Call get record notify change passing the record ID to trigger a platform-wide refresh. 3. If multiple wires are involved, I centralize the refresh logic in a shared service, so every mutation path uses the same refresh contract. I never rely on reassigning the property manually. That bypasses the wire cache and creates inconsistent state. This guarantees the UI always reflects the latest server state without duplicate calls or race conditions.
35. What is the difference between event.stop propagation and event.prevent default?
Answer: these two methods solve completely different problems, and confusing them is an instant red flag in staff-level reviews. Event.stop propagation stops the event from bubbling up the DOM tree. It prevents parent handlers from receiving the event. Event.prevent default stops the browser's default behavior for that event, such as a form submission, a link navigation, or a checkbox toggle. In LWC, I use stop propagation only when I want to isolate a custom event inside a component wrapper, and prevent default when I need full control over native actions.
The universal interview tip. Whenever you ask a tech VP or an industry mentor how to crack a tough interview, they all give you the exact same tip. Get familiar with the most commonly asked interview questions. It sounds simple, right? But here is the problem. The search nightmare. Finding the actual most commonly asked questions for senior roles is a nightmare. Generic Google searches only give you basic textbook definitions, and those will not help you clear a lead architect or senior engineer round where production reality matters. Imagine a master vault. Now, imagine a vault where the absolute most commonly asked interview questions for your specific role are already collected for you, perfectly organized by interview rounds like 1. Most commonly asked technical-based question and answers. 2. Most commonly asked scenario-based question and answers. 3. Most commonly asked real-world problem-solving question and answers. 4. Most commonly asked system design question and answers. 5. Most commonly asked behavioral-based question and answers. Cross-domain mastery. I built the ACE Interviews Master Vault for the modern architect. We did not just do this for one role. We covered everything: SAP, cybersecurity, DevOps, software testing, data engineering, Java, and Python. The ultimate all-access deal. Instead of paying for individual PDFs, you can now unlock our entire database. Get over 1,000 plus PDFs containing 50,000 plus of the most asked question and answers for a mere 1,499 rupees a month. The elite transformation. Stop studying just to pass. Equip yourself with the cross-domain confidence of a true architect and walk out of your next interview choosing between 2 or 3 elite job offers. Unlock the vault now. The era of buying individual guides is over. Click the link in the video description below right now to unlock the Master Vault. Now, let's get back to the masterclass.
36. How do you handle asynchronous operations with promises and async await in LWC?
Answer: in production LWC, I treat every async operation as a potential source of race conditions and unhandled errors, so I enforce a strict pattern. 1. Wrap all async code in try-catch blocks. 2. Prefer async await over raw dot then chains for readability and easier error handling. 3. Use promise.all only when operations are truly independent. Otherwise, I chain them explicitly to maintain order and transaction integrity. 4. Always add a finally block to reset loading states and prevent UI deadlocks. At the staff level, I also add timeout wrappers around external calls so the UI never hangs indefinitely.
37. Can we perform DML inside a wire annotated method?
Answer: no. And this is not a suggestion, it is a hard platform restriction. The wire service requires the Apex method to be cacheable, and any DML inside a cacheable method throws an exception at runtime. At the staff level, I treat this as a strict design guardrail. Wire is reserved exclusively for read operations. Any write path must use an imperative call so we can properly control transaction boundaries, error handling, and rollback logic.
38. What is callback hell and how do you avoid it in LWC?
Answer: callback hell is the deep nesting of multiple dot-then callbacks that makes code unreadable and error handling impossible at scale. I avoid it completely by 1. Using async await everywhere possible for flat linear code. 2. Extracting each async step into its own well-named private method. 3. Centralizing error handling in a single catch block at the highest level. 4. Using promise.all or promise.all settled when multiple independent calls are needed. This keeps even the most complex orchestration logic readable and maintainable, exactly what staff-level code must demonstrate.
39. How do you implement conditional rendering and slots in LWC?
Answer: conditional rendering and slots are two of the most powerful composition tools in LWC. I exclusively use LWC if, LWC else if, and LWC else, the modern syntax, for all conditional markup because they are truly removed from the DOM when false, unlike CSS hiding. For slots, I expose both named and default slots so consumers can inject custom content without forking the component. At the staff level, I treat slots as part of the public API contract and document exactly what markup is allowed inside each slot to prevent misuse.
40. What is the role of the constructor in LWC and its limitations?
Answer: the constructor is the very first lifecycle hook and is used only for initializing class fields and binding event handlers. The two unbreakable rules at the staff level are: 1. Never call Apex, never access the DOM, and never set at API or attract properties inside the constructor. 2. Keep it extremely lightweight. Any heavy logic belongs in the connected callback. Violating these rules leads to undefined behavior and is one of the fastest ways to fail a senior code review.
The universal interview tip. Whenever you ask a tech VP or an industry mentor how to crack a tough interview, they all give you the exact same tip. Get familiar with the most commonly asked interview questions. It sounds simple, right? But here is the problem. The search nightmare. Finding the actual most commonly asked questions for senior roles is a nightmare. Generic Google searches only give you basic textbook definitions, and those will not help you clear a lead architect or senior engineer round where production reality matters. Imagine a master vault. Now, imagine a vault where the absolute most commonly asked interview questions for your specific role are already collected for you, perfectly organized by interview rounds like 1. Most commonly asked technical-based question and answers. 2. Most commonly asked scenario-based question and answers. 3. Most commonly asked real-world problem-solving question and answers. 4. Most commonly asked system design question and answers. 5. Most commonly asked behavioral-based question and answers. Cross-domain mastery. I built the ACE Interviews Master Vault for the modern architect. We did not just do this for one role. We covered everything: SAP, cybersecurity, DevOps, software testing, data engineering, Java, and Python. The ultimate all-access deal. Instead of paying for individual PDFs, you can now unlock our entire database. Get over 1,000 plus PDFs containing 50,000 plus of the most asked question and answers for a mere 1,499 rupees a month. The elite transformation. Stop studying just to pass. Equip yourself with the cross-domain confidence of a true architect and walk out of your next interview choosing between 2 or 3 elite job offers. Unlock the vault now. The era of buying individual guides is over. Click the link in the video description below right now to unlock the Master Vault. Now, let's get back to the masterclass.
41. How do you debug LWC components that are not displaying data correctly?
Answer: when data is not displaying, I follow a systematic debugging framework. 1. Verify the wire or imperative call actually returned data using console.log on the raw result. 2. Check for undefined or null guard conditions in the HTML template. 3. Validate that API properties are being passed correctly from the parent component. 4. Use the Lightning Web Inspector or browser dev tools to inspect the rendered shadow DOM. 5. Finally, enable debug mode in the org and check for silent wire errors in the console. This structured approach lets me resolve 95% of data display issues in under 5 minutes, even in the most complex component trees.
42. How do you handle form validation with custom error messages in LWC?
Answer: I never rely solely on HTML5 validation because it is too limited for enterprise rules. The staff-level pattern is: 1. Perform all validation in JavaScript on form submit or on the blur event. 2. Set custom validity messages directly on Lightning input or Lightning combo box using set custom validity and report validity. 3. Surface both field level and form level errors with consistent toast or inline messages. 4. Keep validation rules in a centralized service so the same business logic is reused across components. This guarantees a uniform user experience and prevents invalid data from ever reaching Apex.
43. Explain the reactivity system in LWC and what makes a property reactive.
Answer: LWC reactivity is built on a precise contract. All primitive properties are reactive by default. However, objects and arrays are only reactive if they are decorated with a track or if they are reassigned entirely to a new memory reference. Deep mutations inside complex objects are ignored unless you use a track or create a new reference via the spread operator. At the staff level, I treat reactivity as a performance surface. I mutate state only when absolutely necessary and use immutable patterns for complex state to avoid unnecessary re-renders across large component trees.
44. How do you implement sorting with formatted fields like currency or date in a data table?
Answer: formatted fields break default client-side sorting because the displayed string value is different from the raw numeric or date data. I solve this by 1. Providing a custom type attribute sorter function that extracts the raw numeric or date value. 2. For server-side sorting, I pass the actual field API name, not the formatted label, to Apex so the order by clause works on the correct database column. 3. I always test with edge cases like null values, negative currency, and different locales, because these are where most implementations silently fail. This ensures sorting remains correct and consistent regardless of how the field is visually displayed to the user.
45. What are Lightning Web Security (LWS) restrictions in LWC?
Answer: Lightning Web Security is the modern browser-based security model that replaces the old locker service. At the staff level, I treat LWS as a hard architectural boundary. No direct DOM access outside your component's shadow tree, no unsafe eval, no third-party scripts that bypass the sandbox, and strict enforcement of content security policy. I design every component to be fully LWS compliant from day one, because any workaround, like global this hacks or inline scripts, will inevitably break in future releases and immediately fail enterprise security reviews.
The universal interview tip. Whenever you ask a tech VP or an industry mentor how to crack a tough interview, they all give you the exact same tip. Get familiar with the most commonly asked interview questions. It sounds simple, right? But here is the problem. The search nightmare. Finding the actual most commonly asked questions for senior roles is a nightmare. Generic Google searches only give you basic textbook definitions, and those will not help you clear a lead architect or senior engineer round where production reality matters. Imagine a master vault. Now, imagine a vault where the absolute most commonly asked interview questions for your specific role are already collected for you, perfectly organized by interview rounds like 1. Most commonly asked technical-based question and answers. 2. Most commonly asked scenario-based question and answers. 3. Most commonly asked real-world problem-solving question and answers. 4. Most commonly asked system design question and answers. 5. Most commonly asked behavioral-based question and answers. Cross-domain mastery. I built the ACE Interviews Master Vault for the modern architect. We did not just do this for one role. We covered everything: SAP, cybersecurity, DevOps, software testing, data engineering, Java, and Python. The ultimate all-access deal. Instead of paying for individual PDFs, you can now unlock our entire database. Get over 1,000 plus PDFs containing 50,000 plus of the most asked question and answers for a mere 1,499 rupees a month. The elite transformation. Stop studying just to pass. Equip yourself with the cross-domain confidence of a true architect and walk out of your next interview choosing between 2 or 3 elite job offers. Unlock the vault now. The era of buying individual guides is over. Click the link in the video description below right now to unlock the Master Vault. Now, let's get back to the masterclass.
46. How do you use the UI Record API module and when to use it over Apex?
Answer: I use the UI Record API module. Specifically get record, update record, create record, and delete record, whenever the operation is standard CRUD on a single record or a small set of fields. The key advantages are automatic field-level security enforcement, built-in caching, and platform notifications. I switch to Apex the moment I need complex SOQL with joins or aggregations, custom business logic inside the same transaction, bulk operations beyond a single record, or when I must guarantee a strict database transaction boundary. In staff-level architecture, this decision is documented per component so future developers understand exactly why one path was chosen over the other.
47. What is the difference between Aura components and LWC?
Answer: Aura and LWC are fundamentally different architectures. Aura uses a proprietary two-way data binding model with a heavy framework wrapper, while LWC is built on native web standards with one-way data flow, true shadow DOM encapsulation, and significantly better performance. LWC has a much smaller bundle size, faster rendering, and full support for modern JavaScript. At the staff level, I treat Aura as legacy. I only maintain it when forced by existing technical debt. Every new development and every major refactor is done in LWC because the long-term maintainability and scalability gains are non-negotiable.
48. How do you implement optimistic versus pessimistic locking in LWC data handling?
Answer: I choose between optimistic and pessimistic locking based strictly on user experience versus data integrity requirements. 1. Optimistic locking. I update the UI immediately on the client, send the change to Apex, and only roll back the UI if the server rejects it. This gives the fastest perceived performance for the user. 2. Pessimistic locking. I acquire a hard lock, using Apex for update or a custom lock record, before allowing the user to even edit the fields, then release it on save or cancel. In staff-level design, I always document which approach is used per screen and combine it with version fields so even optimistic flows remain safe under concurrent edits.
49. How do you manage version control, code reviews, and deployment for LWC projects?
Answer: I enforce a strict Git flow strategy with feature branches, mandatory pull request reviews, and automated static code analysis, PMD plus EaseLint in the CI pipeline. Every LWC change goes through a senior reviewer who checks for 1. Reactivity issues and unnecessary DOM re-renders. 2. Performance budgets and LWS compliance. 3. Just unit test coverage strictly above 85%. Deployment is fully automated via Salesforce DX and GitHub Actions, including Scratch org validation, package version creation, and staged rollout to production. This process ensures zero surprises even when multiple developers are working on the same large LWC codebase.
50. How do you stay updated with the latest Salesforce LWC developments and best practices?
Answer: I treat staying current as a non-negotiable part of the role. Every week I review the official Salesforce release notes, the LWC developer blog, and the monthly Salesforce Developers YouTube channel. I actively participate in the LWC Trailblazer community, follow key product managers online, and maintain a personal LWC experiments org where I test every new feature, like new directives, enhanced wire adapters, or LWS updates, before it ever hits production. At the staff level, this continuous learning is what separates engineers who ship modern, future-proof solutions from those who keep riding outdated patterns.
The universal interview tip. Whenever you ask a tech VP or an industry mentor how to crack a tough interview, they all give you the exact same tip. Get familiar with the most commonly asked interview questions. It sounds simple, right? But here is the problem. The search nightmare. Finding the actual most commonly asked questions for senior roles is a nightmare. Generic Google searches only give you basic textbook definitions, and those will not help you clear a lead architect or senior engineer round where production reality matters. Imagine a master vault. Now, imagine a vault where the absolute most commonly asked interview questions for your specific role are already collected for you, perfectly organized by interview rounds like 1. Most commonly asked technical-based question and answers. 2. Most commonly asked scenario-based question and answers. 3. Most commonly asked real-world problem-solving question and answers. 4. Most commonly asked system design question and answers. 5. Most commonly asked behavioral-based question and answers. Cross-domain mastery. I built the ACE Interviews Master Vault for the modern architect. We did not just do this for one role. We covered everything: SAP, cybersecurity, DevOps, software testing, data engineering, Java, and Python. The ultimate all-access deal. Instead of paying for individual PDFs, you can now unlock our entire database. Get over 1,000 plus PDFs containing 50,000 plus of the most asked question and answers for a mere 1,499 rupees a month. The Elite Transformation. Stop studying just to pass. Equip yourself with the cross-domain confidence of a true architect and walk out of your next interview choosing between 2 or 3 elite job offers. Unlock the vault now. The era of buying individual guides is over. Click the link in the video description below right now to unlock the Master Vault. Now, let's get back to the masterclass.
For more exciting tips, tricks, and more importantly, for valuable insights of interviews, please share, like, and subscribe to my channel. It has a lot of valuable information about various insights of interviews. It has a wide range of real-world portfolio projects of various technologies for interviews, and it has wide range of most asked interview questions and answers of various technologies like data science, SAP, AWS, DevOps, and full-stack web development, and more. That will be useful during interviews. It has a wide range of most asked interview questions and answers and real-world portfolio projects of various technologies for freshers, for 2 to 3 years, experienced candidates, and for 5 or above years, experienced candidates to test their skills by knowing most asked interview questions and make themselves ready for interviews.